Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a casual conversation. I'm Tara McPherson. I'm a professor in the School of Cinematic Arts here at USC, and actually know at least a little bit all of our panelists, but I will tell you a little bit about each of them, and then we'll just jump into a conversation. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people and their neighbors, whose ancestors ruled this region for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to this territory have never voluntarily been ceded or legally extinguished, and we pay respects to the members and elders of these communities who still remain stewards of the lands and waters. So I'm going to tell you about our panelists. I'll start with Dr. Tongson, who is in the middle. Dr. Karen Tongson is a Filipino-American cultural critic who currently chairs the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at USC, where she's a professor in that department in English and American Studies and Ethnicity. She currently directs the Consortium for Gender, Sexuality, and Race in Public Culture, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. And next year, she'll be the Presidential Visiting Fellow at Yale. She's the author of several books, including Norm Porn, Queer Viewers and TV That Soothes Us, that we'll talk about today, as well as two other really fantastic works, Why Karen Carpenter Matters and Relocations, Queer Suburban Imaginaries. Right now, she's working on a book on karaoke, so if any of you could prompt her to sing before the hour is over, you will benefit greatly from that experience. Far to my left is Professor David Craig, who's a global media scholar who studied global and Chinese creator cultures. He's been a visiting scholar at Harvard at the Berkman Klein Center and a global Fulbright scholar. He's also been a producer and an executive who worked on over 30 projects that have won Emmys and Peabodys and Golden Globes and a host of other awards in television. He's here today to talk to us about apocalypse television, how the day after helped end the Cold War, but he's also the author of Creator Culture and Global Social Media Entertainment. So Dr. Sparks, who's to my immediate left, is an award-winning television writer, producer, and showrunner with an over 20-year career in television and over 30 years in the arts. Anthony could maybe also dance for us, right? Because he toured with Stomp, in its original touring company, right? His credits as an executive producer and showrunner in television include Bel Air, Mike Tyson, and 6 seasons of Queen Sugar, among many other television credits. He has recently signed first look and script deals at Blumhouse and Warner Brothers, and has an extensive list of awards, including the 2022 NAACP Image Award, the 2020 Television Academy Honors Award, and a 2022 Humanitas Award nomination. He's also a professor and an author and a USC alum. I was honored to be on his dissertation committee. So we, I think to kind of kick us off today, I'd love you each to kind of briefly describe your current projects, your book or the TV show you're working on. And in describing that project, speak to us about why you feel television is a really important kind of cultural object to engage in the moment that we're in. I mean, you could feel free to read something if you want, or just to talk to us more casually about the work. Karen, do you want to start us off?
I knew you were going to come to me first. Thank you for moderating, Tara, and I'm really pleased to be on the panel with everyone. My book, as Tara mentioned, is called Norm Porn, Queer Viewers and the TV That Soothes Us. And the very concept of norm porn is that it's television that might not be made for queer viewers, and that might not even be the kind of television that queer viewers through their politics or aesthetics would want to align themselves with, but we surrender and can't help but love it nonetheless. And it's often TV programming that folks think of as comfort TV, like Gilmore Girls, Parenthood, This Is Us, and I also write about 30-something as the kind of origins for this type of realist series. And thinking about how these shows present new normals and avenues for belonging that feel really cheesy and maybe unreal, but that nevertheless activate our tears and our fantasies. So I think that that's sort of like a good shorthand for what the book is, and kind of wrestling with, from my point of view, those attachments that are both political and aesthetic. And I think that television remains an important medium to engage, even if it seems like nobody really, quote unquote, watches TV in the same way anymore, because, for the longest time at the kind of height of, I suppose, the imperial U.S., the U.S. in its kind of strongest moments from post-World War II onward, TV is the legislator of norms. TV is the thing that tells us, that depicts the American family, that sometimes stretches the boundaries of what that American family might be or represent. And more often than not, it presents the possibility to imagine yourself into a world that you might otherwise be shut out of, at the same time that world and that structure, the industry, can shut you out of it. So I'll stop there for now. And that's just sort of, obviously a lot of contradictory feelings that I've expressed, a push and pull, the draw towards certain things. I guess if there's one last thing I can say right now about the book and the project, it's about being able to have complicated feelings and attachments to TV shows without having to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, just because something isn't politically pure or good doesn't mean you should dislike it or discard it. And at the same time, it's sort of, it doesn't mean you have to accept it wholesale either. You can have a complicated relationship, and I'm all here for that.
David, how about you?
That's hard to follow. Wow. I just wanted to call back the reference to duck and cover for earthquakes, because my book has a relationship to duck and cover for nuclear bombs. Back in the middle of the 20th century, school kids were told that all it took was hiding under a wooden desk would save you from annihilation from what are the most powerful weapons on the planet. And the reason why a lot of our students today wouldn't even be aware of that is because the concept of an atomic war destroying the planet 10 times over went away sometime around the mid-'80s once nuclear disarmament became embraced by the two main superpowers, who for the previous 40 years had ramped up enough arms to destroy the planet many times over in a spectacularly insane sort of diplomacy that they called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And it was, and we now know, not only an extraordinarily fraught strategy, but we now know that we were this close to a dozen fatal near misses, where it was literally one button away from World War III. And that was the world that I grew up in. And this book is about how television helped bring an end to that whole event. In 1983, a television movie called The Day After aired. It was watched by, according to the ratings, 100 million people. If you can imagine that number of people, that's just in the United States alone. That, of course, is based on Nielsen, which wasn't also rating the number of people sitting in churches and in school assemblies that had all assembled, because it became a cultural phenomenon. But everything leading up to that movie would have suggested that no capitalist media industry in their right mind would have aired such a film. And there was a tremendous political backlash by the nuclear right, who had every reason to be fearful that this would cause moral panic. It would cause a huge amount of problems for the Reagan administration, who was very much operating from this notion of strength through power through strength, peace through strength, sorry. And yet, despite all of these conditions, somehow a very remarkable band of storytellers, starting with a television executive by the name of Brandon Stoddard, who used to teach at USC, came up with the concept, of what would happen if nuclear bombs fell on Lawrence, Kansas, commissioned a writer who fully signed on to the approach, which was this is not meant to be a political film. It's meant to be an American story, a middle American story about the end of our world as we know it. It was to focus not only everything leading up to, but the aftermath of the bomb, which most people had very little knowledge or awareness of. And so over the course of about 2.5 years, this film was developed and then produced. And there was such a backlash to the making that up until the very moment that it aired, people thought it would not appear. But all that backlash, of course, fed into the appeal. But it was important to note that there was one person in particular that watched the film, and that was Ronald Reagan, who had seen it in a private screening a month before, wrote very clearly in his diaries, I am deeply moved and depressed, and this was very effective, and there must be something more we could do. And within a span of 3 months, historians have written at length that within the span of 3 months, he did a 180 in terms of his policy, his practices, his strategy, his relationship with the Soviet Union. Just 6 months prior to this movie, he described the Soviet Union as the evil empire and was threatening to put a new military system in space we know as Star Wars. A year later, he was talking about how we are all God's children and we should reach out and find ways that we can all learn to live together on this planet. Historians described it as Reagan's reversal, and they've all identified it as having something to do with the effect and impact of having seen that film. So my book, Apocalypse Television, is the making of and the fallout and backlash against and the fallout from, and including this reversal in the political sphere that helped precipitate the end of the Cold War and the arms race.
I love how the book reminds us that the mass audience for broadcast TV is very different than the audience, kind of our proliferating channels of TV can garner today, right? So I thought that was a very interesting way you integrated a sense of the audience into the book itself. And, it's a very clear story that, TV has mattered powerfully at key junctures. Anthony, what about you?
First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm actually sort of just fascinated, and I'm going back to when I was a kid watching The Day After, and I'm thinking about in the experience and story you just shared with us, the power of television. And it reminds me that I came into television very much wanting to, yes, work, but I came in with a purpose. And I really did want to come into television to try to sort of place my hands on the apparatus that sort of, litigates or what was the term you used about norms? Legislates norms. I very much came into television in the early aughts with that idea that I wanted to contribute to that, partly in response to the experiences I and many of my peers had when I was an actor, a young black actor in New York trying to break into TV and television and experiencing over and over again people telling me that I did not exist as a type and that I did not seem like I was from the South Side of Chicago, whatever that meant. And so I realized I had to enter into the conversation about what television is a lot sooner, typically, than an actor gets an audition. So for me, I have had the nerve, according to some people, to actually try to come in and embrace the message of television. I have, can be said a little bit easier now than perhaps 10 years ago, where I would get open and not so open pushback for the fact that I was very clearly trying to engage stories that might have meaning, which to me, I don't see how any story in television doesn't have meaning. It's just that whether you're going to guide that meaning or not. So I don't have a book. I am a TV writer, so you watch or you don't. You know what I write. But what I am working on, and I'm privileged to work on right now, on several shows that I'm creating currently, and finally gotten to a point in my career where people want to hear what I have to say and what I might want to create. And I'm very, very humbled, and also take on the mantle of creating for television seriously. And so right now the projects that, I'll talk about 2 of the 4 projects that I'm working on, and one is an examination of the police department and race in cities across the country. Sounds like a great evening, right? To watch TV. I swear to you, it is very entertaining. I believe in entertaining, but I also believe in asking important questions by taking seriously the power of television, as you talked about the day after, and as you talked about as a legislator of norms. I'm a kid who grew up watching the Brady Bunch and wondering why my house didn't look as nice. And I've sort of been chasing that sort of question my entire career, both as a practitioner and as a thinker and academic.
And I grew up watching Gilligan's Island and thinking it is possible to have an alternative family that you may love, hate, but you're all stuck on the island together and you got to figure out how to make it work.
Right.
So Sherwood Schwartz occupies our minds a lot.
Yes.
From
Yes.
our generation.
Yes.
Anthony, I want to follow up a little bit on that and get you to talk to us about sort of the stage in between when you started in TV and the place you're in now, creating your own series, and what the impact of show running Queen Sugar for as long as you did was,
Yes.
and how original and unique that show was
Yes.
in the TV landscape.
Right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about that show. Queen Sugars will be, TV writers, no matter what your career is, if anyone talks to you, there will always be a name and then a parentheses and like 2 or 3 shows that you're known for. I'm very proud that I think Queen Sugar will probably be one of those shows. It came along at a great time in my career and a great time, I think, in the television industry to be able to present the everyday life, a black family, and to say that their everyday life sort of mattered. And in that way, it was an incredibly important show. For me personally, it was important because these were black people in the South. My family is originally from the South, from the Deep South. And my mother, it was definitely the most favorite show that I had ever done was that show because she got to see, for the first time before she passed, she got to see people she recognized, stories she recognized, being taken very seriously and sort of gorgeously rendered. And she never quite got the name of the show right. She always was like, "What's happening on Honey Sugar next week?" It's like, but. And so that show had an unapologetic embrace of the importance of storytelling in television. If you want to call that political, if you want to call it whatever you want to call it, we were very unapologetic about the fact that we were telling stories that were, yes, everyday stories, but that the existence of blackness in this country is inherently political. So therefore, why should we back away from that? If I could, since you asked, if I could share one thing from the show, from the, I had it here. Hang on, come back. Yes. So one of the things about the show that was really, really powerful for me was, again, this sort of unapologetic stance. When the pandemic happened and the racial conversation and the murder of George Floyd happened in 2020, I was asked to throw out the season that we had written for Queen Sugar, that we were in the midst of shooting, and write a new season that would address the moment. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, to throw out 9 completed scripts of TV and come up with one other writer assisting me, another 9 episodes of television,
Wow.
record time. But I did it because I got to write the following, if I could. I got to open a show with a camera trained on a character who was established as an activist and also a journalist, while she paid tribute to black citizens of this country who had died at the hands of police violence. And she read those names. And so for me, this was a moment for me of why I got into television, as this character stared directly into the camera, into our audiences, into the millions of people who might be watching, and said, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown Jr., Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Natasha McKenna, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Betty Jones, India Kager, Freddie Carlos Gray Jr., Jordan Davis, Dominique Fells, Raya Milton, Walter Lamar Scott, Antoine Rose II, Atiana Coquise Jefferson, Michelle Foucault, Elijah McClain, Daniel Prude, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. So I'll probably never get to do something like that again. But I wanted to take advantage of the moment to do something that you could not do before. And that was, probably as proud a moment as anything I've ever gotten to do in TV, was to pay homage to those fallen citizens at the hand of police violence. And so to me, when you talk about the potential of television and how we don't watch television quite in the same way that we used to, but the fact of the matter is it is still the only medium that can still sort of command 100 million people, a lot less often than it used to, but it can do that, and so we have to take it seriously.
Thank you so much for reading those names for us, for writing those episodes, and for bringing, their lost lives into memory with us here. It's profoundly important. I mean, Queen Sugar was also, really the first long-running Black cast drama, right?
Yes, I mean, it was a show that it was the longest-running Black family drama in television history. So I take great pride in having been a major part of that. It also sort of imprints on me as a writer and creator that a lot of TV writers, in my opinion, struggle with the power of the medium. A lot of them come into TV because they like storytelling. They like TV, and then you realize you have your hands on the steering wheel of pop culture. And a lot of people go, no, I just want to write and get paid and go on about my business. But I, as a Black man, know what it feels like to have the framework of my life, or my life framed through what other people see on that TV screen. And I'm the one who has to navigate that, and other people like me and any other marginalized person, as we sort of try and navigate what the norms are that are pumped out of that apparatus day after day after day for 100 years. You can't escape it. Yeah. So, try to do my small part to push at the boundaries of what those norms can be.
Thank you.
Could I just chime in for 1 second?
I
Related
was
to
just
this
about
is
that.
In the post-summer of racial reckoning in 2020, I think that we remarkably saw the shows that stepped up to that moment or tried to, and may have even kind of redirected their trajectories, like This Is Us, I think, because initially it seemed like it could have gone the route of, the kind of, in a more dramatic fashion, the Webster different strokes, narrative around transracial adoption. But what ends up happening is that there's a kind of irreconcilability that they just allow to happen, between Randall Pearson and his family in the conversations and dialogues they have. They're like, Kate says to him, you never said anything about this before, Mom and Dad tried. And he actually says, it's not enough. Frankly, it's not enough. I love you all, you're my family, but in the end there is this this irresolvable dilemma. And I think that it's important to let non-resolution happen in that context, and that I do appreciate that there were shows certainly who made that in their writers' rooms also, who made that effort in the wake of that.
And I want to get you to talk a little bit, Karen, about how your book so poignantly addresses grief in relation to television. Because you're writing about shows that might have different trajectories than what we think of as the most political television, right? But you write, as you always do in your other work as well, so eloquently about your own navigation of popular culture in relation to your own feelings, including grief both on a personal and intimate scale and at a planetary scale, given what we've lived through recently, right? So can you talk a little bit about grief as one of the frameworks for the book?
Yeah, absolutely. The book actually is generated by grief. The reason that I watched shows that were comforting in this kind of family holding you way, and wanted to write about it, was that I suffered a tremendous year of loss between 2013 and 14, where I lost 5 very close people in my life, including my grandmother, one of my best friends, etc. And so I found myself watching the show Parenthood and just sobbing uncontrollably, understanding that I was being manipulated somewhat by the medium and its sentimentality. And then when I posted about it on Facebook, as people did 10 years ago, I received a lot of feedback from folks who, maybe in the same kind of emotional state, who were like, I resented every tear it extracted from my cold, dead eyes, and my heart, right? So I was like, okay, well, let's rest in this feeling. Let's think about this feeling. And so, but what began is that sort of exploration of shows like that we would watch, in part actually for catharsis or for relief, in the kind of, that's where the sort of the porn part of norm porn comes in. It's just sort of like, why am I crying at this? I don't even want this kind of family or whatever. Is that on a planetary scale, you say, at least on a national scale, I started writing this book about just that. And then 2016 happened, and our sense of what was normal or what norms were or how people participated in them shifted dramatically when Trump was elected, to the point where suddenly people who were anti-normative, including queer politics folks, are suddenly like, this isn't normal. We need to get back to normalcy. Like what? I'm like, wait, what's happening? What are these meanings that are shifting around? So, I write about the grief from that period, but also the political grief that accumulated from 2016 through. I open with Biden's inauguration, and in fact, the declaration of victory on the Delaware riverfront on November 7th, 2020, as a scene of political norm porn and stagecraft, where essentially it's like this vision of this expanding American family. It's a diversification with Kamala Harris and her brood as well on the stage, and just whatever, Coldplay's Sky Full of Stars playing in the background, and the kind of like that again. I'm not someone who would typically admit to crying at that, but I did. And what is the nature of those tears? What is the relief that we're talking about that happens politically? What are the politics of these shows? What are the politics of Gilmore Girls and, our grieving after Roe v. Wade is overturned? And, when we revisit that show, what are the reproductive politics of Gilmore Girls? And it's like, whoa. So anyway, that's sort of those are the scales of grief. I had to rewrite the book entirely after 2016, and I had to get it out before the next election, because I'm like, who knows what's going to happen next?
I love the way the book signals the risk of being a scholar who deals with the present, right? And that you have to keep rewriting because the world doesn't stand still. I mean, David, your book is taking us back, right, to a different time. And it's quite different than your first 2 books, right? So I wonder if you could talk, or 3 books, I hope you could talk to us a little bit about how you came to do the work on this particular book, and, the kind of archive you drew on to do the work that you did, right? Because it's telling us in great detail the story of the kind of making and resistance to this landmark television film. So what drew you to it, and how did you undertake it?
Sure. I hope you don't mind if I take you on a little bit of a journey.
Okay.
I came to Hollywood in 1982. As I tell my students, there are 3 good reasons to come to Hollywood. I chose the 5th. I grew up a queer Jewish redneck in a right-wing Southern Baptist conservative family. That makes no sense, not even to my therapist. But television was where I found another world. where I found other worlds where there was a possibility of acceptance, a possibility of creating new norms. But it was more importantly where I learned about race relations. Growing up in the South, I wasn't given textbooks that talked about the civil rights movement. I wasn't hearing about King in my Southern Baptist church. I wasn't raised in a family that got newspapers or even watched the evening news. But I went to an elementary school that showed me the story of Jane Pittman walking to a water fountain, and showed Brian Piccolo and Gale Sayers forming allyship in the NFL and helping to integrate the NFL. And to me, television was the most powerful. At the time, I thought it was film because these were all TV movies. I didn't know. Oops. Anyway, yeah, so I grew up wanting to come to Hollywood to be a teacher. And it quickly became clear to me that that meant making television movies. In the mid-'80s to the mid-2000s, television movie was the premier, most considered quality TV, and it was the way in which you could not only aggregate the most viewers in a single night, but also you could take them through an Aristotelian catharsis and hopefully transform their view and understanding of the world. And it was all beamed into our living rooms on these gigantic appliances, and we all sat around it in what Horace Newcomb used to call the cultural forum, right? It was a hearth. It's more now like a Roman Colosseum, but at the time, it was more of a place where we all came together in various forms of fragments of whatever we called family back then to observe and learn. And it was the same medium that we got our TV news. You turn the channel and you get your game shows, you get your sitcoms, and then you get these occasional social issue TV movies that foreground topics that you wouldn't otherwise have ever considered thinking about. So I thought if they can convince us to be aware of our very fraught history of race relations, they might also do the same around queer issues. And I came out, the day I came out, Time Magazine came out with the story of gay cancer. And my whole trajectory completely changed as a consequence. So I came to Hollywood to not only tell those stories, but also to tell my stories and my community stories, which were at that moment being completely subsumed by the AIDS crisis. I had the privilege to do 30 projects, including a couple of queer and AIDS-themed projects, TV movies, plays, books. And then I also was very active in GLAAD, so by day I would pitch queer-themed projects, and by nights I would lead protests outside the same studios and theaters, so that was a conflict of interest, but it worked. And then there was a natural progression after 25, 30 years of doing that to becoming a teacher of Hollywood, having been a teacher by Hollywood. And I came here to teach these master students how to break into Hollywood for the last 15 years here in the Annenberg School. And then it became abundantly clear that there was a whole new medium out there, which is where these 3 books around creator culture and influencers and all that came out. But I went back and got a PhD 10 years ago. And I took that opportunity to go back and look at the 100-plus queer-themed made-for-television movies that had aired over a decade before those subjects even dared to be mentioned in series or feature films. And then I went and met with the people who made those movies because I'd gotten to know them over my 30 years of making TV movies. And it was in the course of doing about 30 interviews for my dissertation that I got to meet Brandon Stoddard. I wasn't about to let that opportunity go without asking him about the making of The Day After, which is when I discovered this extraordinary rich backstory around these events. I became obsessed. I've been obsessed with the nuclear war and atomic energy for the better part of my whole life and set up a number of projects on that subject. This seemed to be the perfect blend of everything I had done in my career, everything I was teaching in my classrooms, everything that involves this principle I describe as producing to power, learning how to harness media power to advance progress out in the world, to align with social movements and social justice movements and try to raise awareness as part of a means and a tool for progress out in the world. So even though I've walked away from producing television, I had wanted desperately to make this a TV movie about the making of the most important TV movie of all time, the greatest film ever, story ever told. I wound up writing this as a book because I couldn't get the story out of my head. And I couldn't not let these stories find an audience because these people had staked their lives, careers, and families and existence on getting this movie made. Everything was at stake. These were people they had to relocate their families because of the death threats. The backlash was so palpable, and we're all very familiar with those conditions today. Yeah. But as I was writing the book, And I'm literally describing the scene in the China Syndrome where they're shutting down the nuclear power plant. I turned on the TV for a little afternoon writer's break, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant was getting bombed by Russians for the start of the Ukraine war. And I suddenly had chills because I thought, oh my God, we're repeating the same cycle here. And I suddenly saw all of these pundits and experts talking about the very real, palpable threat of World War III, nuclear war, nuclear conflagration, the threat of nuclear power plants going under, China Syndrome. It was basically a cycling through, and it's starting to turn into a science fiction premise. Like everything I was writing, I was turning on TV, it was happening and playing out in real time. And that included the social justice movements that we are still desperately trying to move forward, that was heightened at that moment. So suddenly it took on more than this is a really cool, fascinating historical story about TV, to suddenly this is a lesson and a pedagogy that we ought to take away today. That we're going to have to harness the power of media in its current state, and we need the best storytellers in the world and the best critics in the world to help us understand and the value of how narrative has been the way in which all sentient beings have progressed on this planet since the dawn of time, since we left whatever cave or sewer or cesspool. So
I was had the slightly uncanny experience of reading your book while watching Fallout on TV, right? So we're definitely still in a nuclear moment, right, of awareness around it, right? I am. It's not often when you sit with three professors on stage, because Anthony is also a professor, right, that they also are so engaged outside of the university in their careers and doing work that's very public facing, right? So, I would call you all three public intellectuals in the tradition that, scholarship has honored, right? And you each have such hybrid activities you undertake. I would, recommend many of the podcasts that Dr. Songson has produced. David has been on, involved with over 30 different shows. You heard about Anthony's, but, he also teaches and has published a book on giftedness, right? So could you each speak a little bit about why those hybrid identities are so important to you? And, I think people are often rewarded for doing a single thing deeply and well, but none of you have taken paths like that. And what motivates you to have this broader engagement in the world?
I'm weird. Except that I'm not, actually, right? When I first became a TV writer, I did feel the pressure to renounce my past as an actor back in my heathen days or something like that. I feel like now I wouldn't have to do that. There's a bit more acceptance of that. But I just sort of felt that if I had an interest and perhaps an ability that could be nurtured in a couple of different ways, that it was my responsibility to try and get that out. And also, for me, so the academic space for me, as you well, first of all, I have to give Tara thanks. Tara did not know me. I was a young actor from New York who somehow got sent her way. I don't even know if you remember.
I do.
Oh, okay.
It was in the old building.
It was in the old building, and I got sent your way, and you didn't know me from Adam. And I was like, hey, so I'm thinking I could be a TV writer and a PhD. And you didn't laugh in my face, and you didn't, because there are institutional pressures that I bumped into, even at my beloved institution here, that do challenge this hybridity that you're talking about. And I was definitely challenged in that. But I just don't buy into the false dichotomy of creative or intellectual. I don't understand it. And the people I hang out with, we don't understand why people make that sort of, the most creative people I know are whip smart, and the smartest people I know are creative. And so I count it a great blessing and privilege in my life that I have been able to somehow pull those two together. But it's very important to me that I I was not an easy PhD student. I resisted theory in a way that I don't anymore. But I even told a professor, it's amazing I even finished. I literally stood on the steps of the bookstore and I told the professor to their face that theory was bullshit. All right, as a first-year grad student, as only a first-year grad student would, right? And what I was concerned about, and this gets to I'm getting to the point, was I never wanted to be an intellectual who couldn't talk to my mother who had a 6th grade education. I refused. I was like, you are not going to, you can add a language to me,
Right.
but you cannot take away my ability to reach out to the community from which I come. I will not renounce them. As a poor black kid from the south side of Chicago, I will not be, so for me, the intellectual piece and the creative piece, and particularly in TV as a mass medium, is about pulling all of that together as well as I can, and then putting that out into the world. So that's the attempt anyway.
Thanks. Karen?
I think there's just too much work to be done to focus on like a really tiny and minute audience or set of people, and to limit your collaboration and conversations with a highly specialized group of folks. I come from show people. My parents are musicians. My mom's whole side of the family are musicians. And Why Karen Carpenter Matters, I tell a little bit of that story alongside the fact that how I was named after Karen Carpenter. And we couldn't possibly be more different seeming, and yet.
Here's the chance to sing.
Yes. Which is all to say, though, that I think that there's too much work to be done. And also, I think at various points, like, I think that now that I've become an established scholar and academic and I'm a senior person, I find it my task to encourage people like maybe who showed up, like Anthony does show up, right? Like wanting to do a certain kind of work that doesn't fit the kind of strict parameters of what we do. And so whether or not it's supporting junior faculty or grad students or other faculty, I want to push us, to stretch us, to be able to communicate to the widest array of people possible. That's why the consortium that Tara mentioned in introducing me exists. That's why we produce podcasts. We have a new web series about food called Make Me Like It. Please
It's
check
fantastic.
It out. It's about like the British Jamaican food and that diasporan food that you don't like when you're growing up. And Professor Corinne Collins tries to remake that food to make herself like it. So go check that out. I guess it's sort of like it runs in my blood, in my family as a tendency. To want to perform, to reach out to people, to reach wider audiences. And it's too important to seed public culture and conversation and we can't do that as scholars.
And I will underscore, for those of you who might not know, because why would you if you're not at USC, but Karen has done an extraordinary amount of labor to mentor graduate students and young scholars. It's quite remarkable to watch. It's part of that unpaid academic labor that many people avoid because you don't get recognized for doing it. And it's an honor to be your colleague and see how you support people to do the work that matters to them. Yeah.
Says the hardest working person at USC. Thank you, Tara. My example.
I think Anita's the hardest working person at USC. David.
Good Lord, how do I follow that? I think I borrow from W.E. Du Bois' talk about second sight. I always describe growing up queer in the South as having pink vision. I seem to only ever see the world through a lens of power, a little bit like Neo, everything's zeros and ones. So I came to Hollywood to produce To Power, and I was a producer activist at the same time, and then I became a teacher activist here at USC, and now I was just given tenure last week, so now I'm an official, that was deliberate, thank you. But I'm now a professor, but still an activist. And the impulse to teach, to generate knowledge, to speak truth to power, to borrow from the words of Bayard Rustin and Quaker movements is kind of innate. Somehow I was born with a social justice bent, and that had to flow through everything that I do. So I don't know how not to do that sort of work. But I also think it's exhilarating to see the way in which my students come to the classroom asking for strategies and tactics. How do we take this power and this ability and these resources and use it to advance the things that matter to me, that are central to my identity and to my beliefs and my ideology and my values, my identity, my interest. A lot of the work that I've done in the creator culture side, which is over in this other industry, this other cultural industry that's emerged, has been looking at the way in which young people harness this medium not only to make a living, not only for fame, not only for influence, but to advance the things that matter to them. And it's been fascinating. The last year I've spent doing research on Creators for Change, which is a concept that was first coined by YouTube to take credit for all the work of these creators, but has since gone on to be to refer to people, to young people or social media entrepreneurs who are partnering with civil society organizations, nonprofit organizations, social justice movements, grassroots activists to bring together and organize online communities. And I tend to think of creators as for-profit community organizers, and they're now partnering with nonprofit community organizers to figure out how to harness this media and technology to make a difference in the world. So that's baked into everything. It's hard. I don't think of myself as a hyphenate because to me it's completely integrated. It's the same.
Yeah.
How do you not tell stories and not know that the stories you're telling are going to impact and influence what people see, and the stories you're not telling will impact and influence the world as well?
So I have to know where from in the South you're from.
North Carolina.
I'm Louisiana, right? So, yeah.
Different South.
Yeah, but some shared histories, right, of what it meant to grow up in a period when the South was struggling against change, right? And
Still struggling,
and
I
how
think.
young people take that in. Yeah. I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions if you have things you'd like to ask our speakers. So I see in the plaid jacket. Yeah.
I'm not named Karen, but I work with Karen Carpenter and Richards, and my family's in the business too. So when I first saw your book, I actually thought it was a fabulous book years ago reading it, and thank you for that. I've worked in the global side of television for about 40 years now, and watching the transition through all of that, and I think it's just fascinating what doesn't translate, what territories and what doesn't. And it has changed so significantly in the last few years because of the streaming business. And in many ways, people have gotten so incredibly myopic with what they are willing to create and the chances that they're willing to take, because they don't see it's really the emotional connection. If you come up with a great idea, that's not going to be enough. You still have to figure out how to finance it, how to produce it, how to get it sold, and all those things. But if you find the right emotional touch points and the right journey that you can bring people in on, and for years it has been an area that everything just kind of gets handled at a cursory level, that people aren't forced to dig a little bit deeper and say, how can we also make this translate to a wider audience? Not necessarily in every territory, but certainly more globally, here as well as overseas. And I wonder what the thinking is that you have, or you are with teaching your students, what their level of interest in the global world is.
Sure. I've been teaching graduate courses on media industry disruption for 15 years now. I have to say, it's a great time to be a scholar of media industry disruption, a little daunting to be a practitioner. But I would push back a little on the premise, because right now the most successful program on streaming is Shogun, one of the most brilliant pieces of television or streaming I've seen in the last 10 years. We now have The Sympathizer coming out on HBO. And these are being embraced by audiences and reflecting forms of culture that we've never witnessed before. I also am a huge junkie when it comes to reality show programming, and I watch Top Chef, and the level of global cultural work that goes on in that program alone is so mind-boggling that you cannot walk away from there not only hungry, but also having a profound appreciation of how much food is a representation of global culture. And the fact that these are all programs that are being made available to American audiences who have resisted anything that was not parochial is, for me, a profound shift in terms of consumption behaviors. But it is absolutely the case that we are witnessing a spectacular upheaval in the underlying logics of how media industries work. And it's precipitated by a number of circumstances. I am now turning into a pedagogue. Look, I'm stepping into Professor Mull. Well, the structural and material conditions of the television industries are no longer. But streaming is just one of the variants in this change, and the media conglomerates aren't prepared for the wave of disruption that they've handled. And COVID, oddly enough, set them up to think that this was going to happen more quickly than it did, and now everything's fraught. The timing is off. Everything's been thrown off in terms of the normative cycle in which media industries are being disrupted relative to how they have been in the past. But sorry, I'm sounding like I'm standing in front of my classroom. Suffice to say that it's going to be a bumpy ride. It's a very, very tremendously precarious time for people, my students, trying to break into this industry. And the one thing I can only hone to is that if you are see this as not a place to get famous or rich, but rather you come with a deep avocation for this power of media, that's going to serve you well in the long run, but it will certainly be a challenge in the short. So if you don't have that avocation, might I suggest the tire industry or solar power or something else? Otherwise, don't.
It's funny that you say that. I talk to my fellow peers, TV makers and stuff like that, and there is a rather cold-blooded calculus being articulated now, which are people are saying some of y'all gonna have to go home.
Yeah.
Because that's literally what they're saying. There's not enough. The industry is really, disrupted right now, and people don't know whether they're going or coming, but we do know and feel that it is shrinking in terms of the number of jobs and opportunities that are available. And I do think it is going to be, if it isn't already, a bit of a gut check of why are you doing this? And if fame and fortune and being on the cover of a magazine holding a pen, as the next Shonda Rhimes or whoever, if that was your goal, I believe it'll be tested.
And even watching an industry like video games, which is enormously profitable at a level that sort of dwarfs film and television, lay off a third of their global workforce in the last 18 months, right? Capitalism's a bitch, right? Like it's like really
and video games are supposed to be the answer,
Yeah.
right? It's like, but as you just said, they just laid off a third of their global force.
I'll say quickly from the audience perspective around the global TV stuff, because I think that's where it's starting, the kind of affective response to what touches audiences or what have you. I will say that, you mentioned Shogun and The Sympathizer. I do think that there's a way in which the streaming and the proliferation of shows from Asia, whether it's from Korea or even the Philippines or other places, has primed viewers to be able to, like whether it's, people who got into Attorney Woo or what have you, to watch shows, particularly about Asia and the East. I'll say also, just as a bit of trivia related to Karen Carpenter, she watched Shogun, the original series, the night that she passed away, actually. So, but which is to say, I do want to kind of acknowledge that, there is a kind of expanding capacity for audiences to be able to watch across a range of genres and global products, whether or not Squid Game, what have you, or The Traitors, reality series or what have you across the Commonwealth. But it is capitalism that is kind of killing what seemed to be, I believe, like the kind of proliferating possibilities of making stuff that was different and that challenged audiences in different ways.
Yeah. Another question in the audience. There's a hand back here in the black jacket.
Hello. Thanks for you all for being here. And I have a question for Anthony. You were talking about how there was kind of an understanding of the way that your hands are on the steering wheel of pop culture. And I think you do like an incredible job with that, like with Bel Air, for example, of like being aware of that and using it for social good and social change. So I was wondering what conversations like in the writer's room look like And is there awareness of how your shows and stories might be impacting the millions of viewers culturally, politically, and and then also like outside of your specific writers' room, other writers' rooms?
Right.
What do those conversations look like?
Right.
Is there research that goes into certain social issues that needs to be challenged,
Right.
and how you guys tackle that?
Well, my personal answer, which is not the answer of most people, was let's go get a PhD, so I know what I'm talking about. Like, nobody's doing X. Like, it's crazy. Like, there are like 3 of us who did that in all of town. But literally, that was my answer, was because I did a year or 2 in television as a young staff writer, and I was in the writer's room, which is a very veiled space, and I was like, oh, like, this is important what we're doing in this room, and I do not want to be winging it because of, but frankly, many are, actually. Now, some people are being called to task about that, and there is, more media advocacy, and people know, hey, the audience is demanding a greater, it's a dangerous word, but I'll use it for the purposes of this conversation, a greater level of authenticity, in the stories that are being told. I will say to you that the writers' rooms where I have flourished and been able to do work that I'm proud of, we were openly having certain conversations. But that's because the leaders of those programs, when I was first coming up, were interested in those conversations. The writers' rooms that I did not enjoy, and they did not enjoy me, they were not interested in those conversations, like openly and with hostility. I had, when I was a mid-level producer, I had a white writer, turn to me in the writer's room. I'm thinking I'm covering up the fact that, like, I'm an undercover agent, right? I'm thinking I'm covering up. Apparently I wasn't covering it up too well, because she turned to me in the middle of a pitch and she said, I hate writers who try to make TV mean something. Yeah. And looked dead at me. And I was like, okay, And those are sort of the pushbacks against a certain sort of work that you're interested in doing that do come. Now, I believe that writer today would hesitate to do that so openly. Cultural conversation has shifted somewhat, although there's pushback even against that shift happening right now. So, so the answer is yes and no. In the best rooms with writers who take the work seriously and know that it has a potential greater impact beyond the conversation in that room, the conversations are rich and complex. And in others, they are complex but not rich, if that makes sense.
And Anthony's dissertation was on being black in the writer's room, right? So it was very interesting. Maybe we'll finish up by having you each tell us what you're watching on TV right now, so the audience will know what to go stream.
I just did. Right? You guys heard it, right?
Shogun, right?
Yeah, Shogun and Top Chef.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Traitors, all seasons, all series, UK, US, Australia, New Zealand. So
Very good.
Just in the last year, The Last of Us. I'm a sucker for any kind of apocalyptic. So I'm trying to get to Fall. I actually tried to put Fallout on last night, and then I got sleepy. But so I'm looking forward to that. So, but yeah, I enjoy Last of Us and right? That's the name of it.
Yeah.
Oh, I like Three Body Problem also.
I liked it too.
Yeah. So I mean, I haven't read the books though, so I think that's one of those adaptation situations where people who've read the books are like, "What's happening?" But I'm like, "Oh, I'm in this world that this TV show created."
I liked Last of Us better than Fallout, but I really enjoyed Fallout.
Okay.
And I
Worth watching.
because my household only watches things after they're already done. We can't watch them week by week.
Got it.
I'm desperate to see The Sympathizer, but I'm not going to watch it till it all drops.
Still all
Yeah.
drops, right?
Yeah.
Can
We've
I
been
also
retrained.
plug
I've had
the
that
Jared Carmichael show? This is a reality show on HBO. It's fraught. It will push everyone's buttons, but it's trying to have
ruthless conversation about identity formation in ways that, as members of our queer community, we haven't seen those stories enough. And I think he's pushing the form, and he's also pushing the movement. And I'm kind of blown away by the show.
Awesome. So, we heard a little bit from each of our speakers also about their identities as activists. And I'd encourage you all to think about your own relationship to the world we're living in, which is deeply fraught, right? Our own campus is deeply fraught. So, if you're up to it, do the work. And when you need a break, television.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.